Hey everybody, Tim Neal here from Logisense, and I am joined by Toby Bargar from a senior tax strategist from Avalara. And we're doing part one of our three-part series where we're looking at the wild, wild west of IoT taxation, how things evolve for the communications industry, how those sorts of things might affect IoT as the industry continues to grow and move forward, and regulators are looking towards that industry. And wanted to spark up a conversation on some different topics and things that you might want to be thinking about when you're in that IoT industry. So Toby, maybe we'll just get started here, and maybe you can share with us to start off with just kind of, what is the current, tax treatment on internet traffic today?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So for the most part, internet in the United States anyway is largely tax-free. And this owes back to a law passed in the late 1990s, the Internet Tax Freedom Act, and it got revised in several, various, revisions over the years, culminating now in the Permanent Internet Tax Freedom Act, which you'll sometimes hear people talk about, PITFA. And so, sometimes people get confused a little bit about what the impact of this was, but the heart of it was a moratorium on state and local taxation of internet access, not things sold over the internet or your Amazon purchases or anything like that, but the actual internet access. And so for a number of years there were states that were kind of grandfathered out because they maybe had tax in place before the law originally went into effect. And there were some variations where for periods of time circuits that were subject to providing internet would sometimes not get the exemption. But now in all 50 states, we have full moratorium from all state and local tax. So pretty good place to be from a tax perspective, right? We'd all like supposed to be selling internet, right? Which is good news. In most types of communications bundles, the internet is generally the biggest component, right? That's growing to become clearly the most important piece of, especially the network operated side of the communications industry is internet. So having that tax protection has been a big advantage.
For sure. So then I guess what was the there's a lot of early days with Skype and some of these other things for being able to do more of kind of a voice over IP, and kind of what turned to more of traditional now handsets and virtualized through the internet. What was the inflection point where that style of communications ended up becoming regulated and taxable as part of that internet traffic?
Yeah, so I've been in the communications tax automation space for a lot of years. So I've been back to pre-existing, before voice over IP was a thing. Initially when VoIP came out, and it was kind of in a similar place to what we see a lot of conversation around IoT communications today, is there was a lot of thought that what this represented was more of an information service as opposed to a phone service, that since it was packetizing voice and delivering it over the internet, moving packets over the internet, normally something that's not taxed thanks to things like the Internet Tax Freedom Act. And so there were initially a lot of providers in the market back in the early 2000s that tried to kind of take advantage and carve that position out. There wasn't necessarily a specific event that kind of flipped that on its head. It was more of a gradual erosion over a number of years that kind of led to the place where today voice over IP is largely taxed very similar to traditional wired telephony was, at least in the US. There was kind of some different approaches to that. We saw some litigation. There were some important court cases that dealt with the issues of whether or not VoIP companies had to provide 911 access, and whether or not they had to participate in state universal service programs and federal regulatory programs. And so some of that got dealt with in litigation, some of it through legislation, sales taxes now pretty much universally apply to those IP services, and that did typically involve going in and revising the statutes and the tax code to include definitions that would cover a broad enough spectrum to bring VoIP services in. And there was also a degree of something that's always been an element in the communications industry of sort of passive aggressive policy changing. And this is the sort of circumstance where maybe you have a jurisdiction that has a broadly defined tax that applies to a large basis, but doesn't specifically call out the new technology or new service that's in question. And they don't necessarily issue a regulation or a any sort of a update, winds up sort of passive aggressively taking place through enforcement. They'll wind up and somebody gets made an example of, they get notified that they're under audit and, oh yes, you should have known that the thing that you're selling was, subject to this definition and fit within our space. And next thing you know, it becomes established precedent. And so there's kind of all three of those paths that we see with the evolution of new technologies winding up migrating into the universe of technology, litigation, legislation, and then just eroding enforcement, I guess, would be the third way.
Yeah. Well, and I guess the follow-up ways that you kind of go through that, right, is that I would imagine IoT is such a broad spanning term, right? And there's the MVNOs providing the communications. There's the hardware aspects of those things, whether it's different radio frequencies, all sorts of different wonderful things going on in there. And I'm sure the argument is that it's just falling under that safe internet traffic side of things. But at what point are there certain things that you would see similarities that may happen from a regulation standpoint that would start to then consider this communications, even though it might only be a machine to machine? Or do you foresee any kind of similarities that may transpire in the IoT industry?
Yeah, I mean, the temptation is to look at it and say IoT, it's got internet in the title, case closed, right? That's kind of obviously the position that everybody on the seller side is probably going to want to default to, which makes great sense, right? We just talked about all the wonderful reasons from a tax perspective why you want your product classified as ISP service. The challenge there is just because we use internet in the description is does it actually meet the tax definitions? And there's still a lot of controversy to probably get resolved in the world of IoT space around that. And there's, in my opinion, a strong possibility that ultimately tax jurisdictions will determine that at least some segments of the IoT space, the connections don't qualify as ISP or internet access. And you might say, well, what would it be then if it's not internet? And so the likely potential argument there would be that it's really more of like a WAN or a LAN connection, that this is private data that's being transmitted. And the crux of that being, that a lot of these devices and connections don't actually involve any sort of ability to surf the World Wide Web and actually get to the public internet, right? It's merely passing data. And so there's an open degree of question about whether or not those types of connections qualify as ISP service under the Internet Tax Freedom Act and the Permanent Internet Tax Freedom Act now. It's not likely to be a scenario because we've now had IoT connections in the marketplace for a number of years, and you might say, well, if what he's saying is correct, that this could be WAN or LAN, how come we're not seeing that yet? How come we're not seeing jurisdictions coming after it? I think a large part of that is that the jurisdictions tend to take their time with this, especially the ones that aren't entirely clear on where this is going to fit within their existing definitions. Is it something that they're going to want to go back to state legislatures and get it specifically drafted in, descriptions for some of these connections? Is it something that we're going to ultimately wind up seeing more? People are going to get audited. There's going to wind up being with litigation, maybe some more of that passive aggressive approach to tax treatment that I was talking about. And then in the background of all of that, there's a big open, question mark about what the FCC will ultimately say regarding some of these connections. And for the most part, the FCC has been pretty quiet to date about information about IoT connections. And we'll have to kind of wait and see what happens there. So unfortunately, it means for folks who are selling IoT, we've got a reality in the current term where there's a bit of an unknown, and that's not necessarily a new phenomenon when it comes to taxing new technology type of services in the marketplace, is that we oftentimes wind up being a little ahead of the tax law. But it does mean that folks have to make some pretty tough business choices sometimes about whether you want to be more risk averse or risk tolerant regarding are you going to be the company that fights the good fight and will challenge the tax jurisdictions on these issues, or go quietly into the night and pay a bunch of communications taxes that maybe your competitors aren't paying. So it's a tricky rock and a hard place there, but hopefully we'll start to see some answers coming in.
Yeah, well, I think that's the key point that you hit on there, right? Is whenever there's new technologies and there's new things that aren't already predefined inside of the existing regulations, well, what does actually apply? Does it fit in this category, or is it something new? And if it's something new, what is that something new, and how would I categorize it and do those sorts of things? So, I guess the way that I always look at it is it's a matter of time, right, before those decisions are made. And like to your point is do you charge tax on your product now in just from a self-preservation standpoint, but then you're in an environment where you're down into possibly the 11th precision point on usage data going across on an IoT solution, and any kind of taxation makes a big deal on volumes that are coming through from a competitive pricing advantage. So there's all sorts of different things to consider when you're putting together your pricing plans, but those are all fantastic points and things to think about. So I think those are kind of the things that we wanted to talk about today in the first part, just kind of taking a look at the history of how things came about from the taxation, things that you might want to consider. If you have any questions around billing or taxation related questions that either Toby or I could help out with, please do send an email to the addresses that are on the screen here. And we really hope that you join us in part 2 of this conversation, where we start talking a little bit about how do you manage the system of constant change. We talked about regulations coming in and how those are being managed at kind of a federal and state and county aspects, and where those are being applied. Well, how do you start and manage all of that change from a taxation perspective when you are trying to adhere to those regulations? So please join us in the next part 2 of our Wild West of the IoT taxation world. And thank you so much for joining us today.